The night sky over Riven 9 was supposed to be quiet. The moons hung heavy and pale above the red desert, and the wind was nothing more than a soft whisper over the metal ruins scattered across the valley. For weeks, Sergeant Elias Kane had been alone here, guarding a forgotten outpost on a forgotten world. It was not glorious work. It was not even important work. But it kept him breathing and gave him something to wake up for each morning. Elias had fought in too many wars and lost too many people to count. The military had promised purpose and brotherhood, but in the end, all it had given him were scars and silence. So when his final mission ended, he took the transfer no one else wanted, a remote communications post on the edge of human territory. Here, the radio barely spoke, and the stars above never answered. It was the peace he thought he needed. But peace ended that night. It started as a thin streak of light across the horizon. At first, he thought it was just another meteor burning up in the atmosphere. But it didn't burn out. It grew brighter, louder. The ground began to shake beneath his boots as the object screamed overhead, cutting through the clouds like a blade. It wasn't a meteor, it was a ship, a dying one. Elias grabbed his binoculars and climbed to the top of the comms tower, heart pounding harder with every second. The vessel was trailing fire and smoke, spiraling violently as pieces of metal peeled away from its hull. It was big, too big to be a drone, too small to be a freighter. And then he saw it. The insignia burned into the side. Not human, alien. The crash came seconds later. The sound ripped through the valley like thunder, shaking the dust from the mountains and sending a shockwave of heat across the outpost. A bloom of orange fire erupted on the horizon as the ship slammed into the ground, carving a long scar into the desert floor. It was less than 5 kilometers away. Elias stared at the rising column of smoke, his breath shallow and cold. He should have called it in, reported the incident, waited for command to tell him what to do. That was protocol, that was safe. But protocol didn't feel right. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the old soldier still living under his skin, but something deep inside him whispered. Someone might still be alive. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his rifle and strapped on his field gear. Just a quick look, he muttered to himself. If no one's alive, I walk away. But even as he said the words, he knew he wouldn't. He'd never been the type to walk away. The desert was unforgiving that night. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it the metallic scent of burning fuel. Ash and dust stung his eyes as he trudged toward the wreck, boots sinking into soft, charred soil. He could feel the heat long before he reached the crash site, a choking, suffocating warmth that pressed against his skin. The ship was in pieces. Massive chunks of twisted metal lay scattered across the dunes, glowing orange from the heat. Sparks hissed and snapped from broken cables, and a thick black smoke coiled into the sky. Elias moved carefully, scanning for movement, for any sign of life. Most of the wreckage was silent. Most of it was dead. Then he heard it, a sound so small and fragile it almost vanished beneath the crackle of fire. A whimper, a cry. Elias followed it, heart racing, until he found the source, a figure pinned beneath a collapsed section of hull. At first he thought it was a child. But as he drew closer, he saw fur, soft, reddish-gold fur, and long, pointed ears twitching weakly in the light. She wasn't human. She was Vulpine. The Vulpine were a distant, mysterious race known more from rumors than from encounters. Few humans had ever seen one alive. Now one was lying here, blood seeping into the sand, breaths shallow and ragged. Elias knelt beside her, scanning the damage. A piece of metal had trapped her legs. Her body trembled with every breath. She opened her eyes, golden and bright even in the darkness, and stared at him. Fear, confusion, pain, and yet trust. "It's okay," he whispered, though he knew she didn't understand the words. "I'm going to get you out." It took everything he had to free her. The metal was heavy and hot, and his muscles screamed with effort. Twice he almost gave up. Twice he almost convinced himself it wasn't worth the risk. But every time he looked at her, this fragile, broken creature clinging to life, he found the strength to keep going. Finally, with a final push, the metal shifted. She gasped, the sound weak but alive. Elias lifted her gently into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how delicate. She tried to speak, but only a soft, trembling sound escaped her lips. "Save your strength," he murmured, adjusting his grip. "You're going to be okay." The trek back to the outpost felt longer than it was. Twice he stumbled, nearly dropping her. Once he thought she had stopped breathing. But when they finally reached the shelter, he laid her carefully on his bunk and wrapped her in a thermal blanket. He did what little field medicine he knew, cleaned the wounds, stopped the bleeding, monitored her vitals. Then he sat beside her and waited. The desert was silent again. The fire on the horizon slowly faded to embers. And in that quiet, Elias felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why her ship had fallen from the stars. But as he watched her chest rise and fall, one thing was certain. His life on Riven 9 was no longer his own. And this was only the beginning. The first night after the rescue passed in uneasy silence. The Vulpine woman slept fitfully on Elias' bunk, tossing and muttering in a language he couldn't understand. Every few hours he checked her pulse, changed the bandages, and whispered words she would never hear. Outside, the desert winds howled against the outpost walls, and the red moon painted the room in ghostly light. When dawn broke, she was still alive. That was something. Elias made himself a pot of bitter field coffee and sat near the corner of the room, keeping his distance. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or if she was even friendly. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, she was a living being he had saved, and that meant she was his responsibility. Hours passed before she stirred. Her ears twitched first soft, triangular shapes that flicked in confusion. Then her golden eyes blinked open, wide and sharp. For a moment she stared at the ceiling, dazed. Then her gaze landed on him. The look in her eyes wasn't gratitude, it was fear. She tried to sit up too fast and cried out as pain shot through her leg. Elias raised his hands, palms open, his voice gentle. "Easy, don't move too quickly, you're hurt." She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone must have reached her because she stopped struggling. Still, her eyes darted around the room, searching for exits, for threats, for anything familiar. When she spotted her torn flight suit on the floor, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself like a shield. Elias sighed. He couldn't blame her. If their positions were reversed, he'd be terrified too. The next few days were a strange dance of silence. She spoke in soft, melodic words he couldn't translate. He answered in plain Terran English she couldn't grasp. Yet slowly they found ways to communicate, a nod for yes, a frown for no. When he offered her water, she sniffed it suspiciously before taking a cautious sip. When he handed her food, she pushed it away until hunger won. It was clumsy, awkward, but it was something. He decided to call her Lyra. The name just felt right, light and graceful, like the sound of wind across glass. The first time he said it aloud, she tilted her head curiously. He repeated it, pointing to her, and for the first time a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Lyra," he said again, more softly. "Lyra," she echoed, voice trembling but clear. It was the first word they shared. Still, trust came slowly. There were nights when she refused to sleep, her back pressed against the wall, eyes fixed on the door as if she expected soldiers to burst through at any moment. Once, she woke screaming, clutching at a necklace that wasn't there. Another time, she tried to leave, limping toward the airlock before collapsing from exhaustion. Elias didn't stop her. He simply carried her back to the bunk, wrapped her in the blanket again, and stayed nearby until her breathing steadied. "You're safe here," he whispered, even though she didn't understand. "I promise." The promise wasn't just for her, it was for himself too. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing a damaged sensor outside, he turned to find Lyra watching him through the reinforced window. Her expression was unreadable, part curiosity, part wariness, part something else. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. She raised a trembling hand and pressed it to the glass. Elias hesitated, then pressed his palm against the same spot from the other side. It was a small gesture, but in that silent moment the wall between them felt just a little thinner. Days turned into weeks. Lyra's strength returned, and with it glimpses of her true self began to emerge. She was quick, graceful, and surprisingly clever. She learned how to operate the outpost's water purifier without being shown. She figured out how to use the comms console to track weather patterns. And she seemed fascinated by the night sky, sometimes sitting for hours by the viewport, ears twitching as she stared at distant stars. But the language barrier still stood between them. Elias tried teaching her basic words, pointing at objects and nomming them slowly. She tried doing the same, teaching him phrases in her tongue. It was frustrating, often hopeless, but it made them laugh. And that laughter, rare and clumsy as it was, became the bridge they both needed. Then one night, something unexpected happened. A storm rolled across the valley, thick with acidic rain and choking dust. The shelter walls groaned under the pressure. Power flickered. For the first time in months, Elias felt a spark of fear. But Lyra wasn't afraid. She moved with purpose, sealing vents, securing supplies, and even pulling him away from a loose panel before it sparked. When the worst of it passed, they sat together by the dim light of the heater. Lyra reached out hesitantly and touched his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact. "Th. she said, the word clumsy but heartfelt. Elias stared at their joined hands, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. "You're welcome," he whispered. The outpost had felt like a tomb before her, a quiet, empty place where he waited for the years to swallow him. Now, with Lyra beside him, it felt alive, different, hopeful. He didn't know what would happen next. She might leave once she was strong enough. Her people might come for her. Or maybe they would part ways, each returning to their separate worlds. But that night, as the storm faded, and her head rested gently against his shoulder, Elias allowed himself to believe in something he hadn't dared to for a long, long time. Maybe saving her had saved him too. And maybe, just maybe, their story was only beginning. Life at the outpost slowly began to change. The silence that once echoed through the halls no longer felt so heavy. Elias still woke before dawn and followed his routine, checking the perimeter, cleaning the rifle, maintaining the communication systems, but now there was someone else there. Someone humming softly in the background. Someone who sometimes watched the sunrise beside him, ears twitching with curiosity. Someone who made the lonely desert feel less like a prison. Lyra. She was healing faster than he expected. Her leg, once broken and weak, grew stronger each day. She still limped, but now she could walk around the small outpost on her own. She inspected everything with wide eyes, fascinated by even the simplest of human technology. Sometimes Elias would find her sitting cross-legged near the comms console, pressing buttons at random and smiling proudly when a screen flickered to life. Other times, she'd stand at the window for hours, gazing at the distant horizon as if searching for something or someone far beyond it. They were still worlds apart. Their conversations were mostly gestures, broken words, and shared laughter, but the space between them was shrinking. She had learned more human words now: water, food, safe, thank. And Elias had managed to mimic a few Vulpine phrases in return, though his accent made her giggle every time. Yet beneath the growing closeness, a storm was building, one neither of them saw coming. It started one afternoon when the outpost sensors detected movement. Elias was outside repairing a damaged solar panel when a sharp beep from his wrist display caught his attention. The signal was faint but steady. Something was approaching from the north. A ship, a patrol, he didn't know, but one thing was certain: someone was coming. He rushed back inside and checked the long-range scanner. It wasn't a ship. It was a land convoy, small, fast, and heading straight for them. His heart sank. It could only mean one thing: scavengers, raiders, men who picked over crash sites for weapons, technology, and sometimes survivors. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't care that Lyra was wounded. "We have to hide," Elias said, even though she didn't understand the words. He gestured toward the storage room, motioning for her to follow. But when she saw the radar screen and the blinking lights, something changed in her expression. Her ears went flat, and her tail, which had always been calm and low, bristled with fear. She knew who was coming. "No," she said firmly, her accent heavy but her meaning clear. "Bad kill." The raiders arrived at sunset. 3 armored vehicles stopped just beyond the ridge, dust rising like ghosts around them. Elias grabbed his rifle and watched through the narrow slit of a window. 6 figures stepped out, humans, rough and armed, their armor patched together from scraps of old military suits. One of them raised a speaker. "Outpost," the voice boomed. "We know about the crash. Hand over the alien and we'll leave you alive." Lyra's breath caught. She backed away from the window, trembling. Elias turned to her, anger boiling in his chest. "They're not taking you," he said, voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "Not now, not ever." The raiders gave him 1 hour. He spent it preparing, sealing doors, powering the shields, loading ammunition. Lyra followed him silently, helping where she could. Once she grabbed his sleeve and shook her head, speaking fast in her language. He didn't understand every word, but the meaning was obvious. "Run." "I'm done running," he said softly. When the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the attack began. Bullets slammed against the outer walls, sparks flying as metal screamed. Elias fired back, picking targets carefully. 2 raiders went down before they even reached the perimeter fence. But there were too many. They kept coming. The door shook violently as they tried to breach it. Lyra stood beside him, gripping a metal pipe, her golden eyes fierce and unyielding. This wasn't the frightened, broken girl he had pulled from the wreckage. This was someone strong, someone who had lost everything and still refused to surrender. A blast rocked the outpost. The main door buckled, hinges screaming. Elias stumbled, his vision blurring from the shockwave. And then he felt it, a hand on his arm. Lyra, pulling him to his feet, speaking words he didn't fully understand but didn't need to. Fight together. Something inside him cracked open. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for orders, for duty, or for survival. He was fighting for someone else. They made their stand in the central chamber. Elias fired until his rifle overheated, then switched to his sidearm. Lyra darted between cover, using her agility to distract and disarm their attackers. The raiders hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected a soldier who had nothing left to lose, or a Vulpine survivor willing to fight beside him. By the time the last one fell, the outpost was a mess of smoke and broken steel. Elias collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. Lyra slumped beside him, fur streaked with soot, her breathing ragged. For a long time, they said nothing. Then, without a word, she reached out and rested her head on his shoulder. "Safe," she whispered. Elias let out a long, shaky breath. "Yeah," he said, "safe." The battle had changed something between them. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued, no longer strangers trying to understand each other. They were partners now, two souls bound by fire and fight, by trust earned in the darkest hour. And as the stars emerged over the silent desert, Elias knew one thing for certain. Whatever future lay ahead, they would face it together. The storm left scars on the land, blackened sand, poisoned puddles, and twisted scraps of metal scattered across the valley. But the deeper scars were the ones left inside the outpost. Since that night, Lyra had changed. She still helped Elias with small tasks, still shared silent meals by the fire, but something inside her had gone quiet. Her laughter, once soft and bright, had vanished. Her golden eyes no longer searched the stars. She spoke less, smiled less. Elias noticed it all, and it hurt. He had seen this before in soldiers returning from war, in refugees who had lost everything. He had seen it in the mirror too. The emptiness, the weight of memories too heavy to carry. Lyra was alive, yes, but part of her was still trapped out there in the wreckage, and no amount of safety could set her free. So he tried something different. One morning, as the twin suns rose over the dunes, Elias left the outpost without his rifle. He carried 2 canteens of water, a pair of oxygen masks, and a small box of food. Lyra watched him with suspicion from the doorway, ears twitching. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. She tilted her head, unsure. He smiled gently and held out his hand. "Please." Something in his voice must have reached her, because after a moment of hesitation, she placed her small hand in his. Together, they stepped into the desert. The walk was long and silent. The air still stank of acid, and the sand hissed beneath their boots. Every now and then, Elias would glance at her, at the way her ears twitched with every sound, at the way her tail dragged slightly behind her when she was lost in thought. She was still healing, inside and out, but she was walking, and that was something. After 2 hours, they reached the crash site. The wreckage was half buried now, swallowed by sand and wind. The once mighty ship was just a skeleton of twisted metal, broken glass, and charred wires. But for Lyra, it was more than debris, it was a graveyard, a memory, a piece of who she was. She stood frozen, staring at it. Her hands trembled, her breath hitched. Elias stayed silent, giving her space. Slowly, she walked toward the ruins. She touched the scorched hull with gentle fingers, whispering words he didn't understand, a prayer, maybe, or a farewell. Then she knelt beside a fragment of the ship's crest, tracing the faded insignia with a trembling hand. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they didn't fall. After a while, she turned back to him. There was sadness in her gaze, yes, but also something new, acceptance. "Gone," she said softly, pressing a hand to her heart. "But here." Elias nodded. "Here," he echoed, placing his hand over his own chest. Something shifted between them that day. When they returned to the outpost, the silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like understanding. And slowly, piece by piece, Lyra began to come back to life. She started asking questions, first with gestures, then with halting words. "What is this?" she asked, pointing at the water purifier. "Why do?" when watching him calibrate the scanner. Elias answered every question patiently, sometimes drawing crude sketches on scraps of paper to explain. In return, she taught him about her people, their stars, their ships, their traditions, using broken English and soft, musical words. Every evening they sat together by the viewport. Lyra would trace constellations in the air, nomming them in her language. Elias would tell stories of Earth, stories of rain and oceans and forests she had never seen. They laughed at their mistakes, teased each other gently, and sometimes, when words failed, they just sat in silence, watching the endless sky. One night, something unexpected happened. They were sharing a simple meal, dried rations and rehydrated soup, when Lyra set down her bowl and looked at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You saved me," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. Elias smiled faintly. "I just did what anyone would." She shook her head. "No, not anyone." She placed her hand over his. "You." It was such a small gesture, warm fingers against his rough skin, but it felt like a weight lifting from his chest. For so long, Elias had believed he was broken beyond repair, a soldier too damaged to save anyone, even himself. But now, in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Purpose. From that night on, they were no longer strangers sharing a shelter. They were partners, two lost souls who had found each other in the wreckage. They fell into a rhythm that felt almost like home. She cooked, he fixed, she learned, he taught, and every day the distance between them shrank a little more. Sometimes, when he was working late, Elias would look up and find her asleep in the chair beside him, ears twitching softly in her dreams. Other times, he'd wake in the middle of the night to find her sitting by the window, humming a tune that reminded him of wind through trees. And sometimes, when the desert was silent and the stars burned bright, he would feel her hand slip into his, a quiet promise that neither of them was alone anymore. They had both been broken once, but now, together, they were learning how to be whole again. And though neither dared say it aloud, both knew the truth. This wasn't just survival anymore. This part VI the choice. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life on Riven 9 slowly settled into a strange, gentle rhythm. Every morning, Elias woke to the soft sound of Lyra humming in the kitchen corner as she prepared breakfast. Every evening, they sat by the viewport and watched the twin suns sink beneath the red horizon, their golden light painting the sand in shades of fire. What had once been a silent outpost, a place of isolation and duty, now felt like a home. But deep inside, both of them knew this peace would not last forever. Elias had been a soldier long enough to understand that nothing stayed hidden. The crash had left a signature. The battle with the raiders had sent out signals. And somewhere out there, beyond the stars, someone was looking for the ship, for survivors, maybe even for the Vulpine woman he had saved. He told himself it was just a matter of time before they found them. But he didn't know how he felt about that anymore. One night while Lyra was sleeping, the radio crackled to life. It startled Elias. The comm system hadn't picked up anything for months. He rushed to the console, adjusting the frequency. Static hissed, then a voice, distant and faint. "To any outpost receiving this, Vulpine distress signal confirmed. Search and retrieval unit en route. Estimated arrival 7 days." Elias froze. His chest felt tight. It was happening. They were coming. He glanced toward Lyra, sleeping peacefully under a thin blanket. Her breathing was soft and steady, her face calm. For the first time, he felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a mix of fear, relief, and heartbreak. She had people, a home, a future, and it was about to come knocking. The next morning, he didn't tell her. He couldn't. He watched her move around the outpost with quiet grace, fixing a damaged water filter, organizing the supply shelf, humming softly to herself. She looked happier than he had ever seen her. And yet every time she smiled at him, the weight in his chest grew heavier. On the third day, she noticed. "Something wrong," she said one evening, tilting her head as they sat watching the stars. "You quiet." Elias forced a smile. "Just tired." She frowned. "No, different." She placed a hand over his heart, a gesture she often used when words failed her. "Here, sad." Her touch was gentle, but it broke something inside him. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Your people, they're coming." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a long time, Lyra didn't speak. Her ears twitched, her golden eyes searching his face. "Coming." He nodded. "A ship, rescue team, they'll be here in a few days." She stared out the window, ears flat, tail still. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any words. Finally, she whispered, "Then I go." It shouldn't have hurt. This was what he wanted for her: safety, family, a chance to return to the life she had lost. But the thought of her leaving felt like a blade twisting in his chest. He had spent years pushing people away, building walls around himself so he wouldn't feel anything. But Lyra had broken through those walls without even trying, and now the thought of losing her terrified him. The days that followed were quiet and strange. Lyra moved through the outpost like a ghost, still helping, still smiling, but something was missing. Her laughter was softer now, her eyes distant. Elias tried to stay busy, fixing equipment that didn't need fixing, cleaning weapons he would never use. But no amount of work could silence the ache in his chest. One night he found her sitting alone on the roof, staring at the stars. The cold wind tugged at her hair and her tail curled around her legs. "Thinking about home?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. She didn't answer for a long time, then she shook her head. "Home," she said slowly, touching her chest, "is not place, is people." Elias' breath caught. "And where are your people now?" Lyra turned to look at him, and for the first time he saw tears glistening in her golden eyes. "Here," she whispered. The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. They sat there in silence, two lost souls under a sky full of stars, knowing that time was slipping away. The rescue ship arrived on the 7th day, just as the transmission had promised. A bright streak of silver tore across the dawn sky, descending toward the valley with a deep, echoing roar. Elias and Lyra stood together outside the outpost, watching it land. Neither spoke. When the hatch opened, a group of Vulpine soldiers emerged, their sleek armor glinting in the sunlight. They spoke rapid words Elias didn't understand, but Lyra did. She stepped forward, answering them in her language. There was joy in their voices, joy that she was alive, that she was safe. One of them gestured toward the ship, inviting her aboard. She turned back to Elias. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind tugged at her hair and his heart pounded painfully in his chest. This was it, the moment he had known would come. The moment she would leave. "Go," he said softly, forcing a smile. "You deserve to go home." She didn't move. "Home," she whispered again, shaking her head. "I told you, is people." And then, to his complete shock, she stepped away from the soldiers and back toward him. One of them shouted something, but she didn't answer. She walked until she was standing inches from him, her golden eyes locked on his. "I choose," she said firmly, her voice trembling but strong. "I choose here, I choose you." Elias' breath caught. "Lyra, you don't have to." "I want," she interrupted. "I stay." The soldiers tried again, calling her name, but she turned her back on them. Slowly, they lowered their weapons and retreated to the ship. A few minutes later, the engines roared and the vessel lifted into the sky, disappearing into the clouds. Silence fell over the valley once more. Lyra stood there, watching the ship vanish, then turned to Elias with a small, trembling smile. "Now," she whispered, taking his hand and pressing it against her chest, "this is home." Elias felt something break and heal inside him all at once. For years, he had believed he was destined to live and die alone, a broken soldier guarding an empty station. But now, standing beneath the endless sky with a Vulpine woman's hand in his, he knew that was no longer true. They had both been lost, both broken, both searching for something they couldn't name. And now they had found it, not in a place, not in a mission, but in each other. The desert wind howled around them, but for the first time in a long time, Elias didn't feel cold. He felt warm, alive, whole. And as they walked back toward the outpost hand in hand, he knew their story was far from over. It was only just beginning. The day the rescue ship disappeared beyond the horizon, the desert felt strangely alive. The air was soft and warm, the wind gentle against the sand, and the sky stretched endlessly above them, not empty but full of promise. Elias stood beside Lyra, his heart still racing from everything that had just happened. She had chosen to stay. Chosen him. It was a decision he never expected, one that still felt unreal, like a dream he was afraid to wake from. Life returned to a rhythm, but it was no longer the same. Something deeper now connected them, not just survival or gratitude, but choice. They were no longer two lost souls thrown together by fate. They were partners, companions, a team bound by something that neither of them could quite name, but both could feel in every glance, every touch, every heartbeat. In the days that followed, the outpost transformed. Together, they repaired the last of the storm damage, reinforcing the walls and upgrading the systems. Elias taught Lyra how to handle the power grid and operate the comms array, while she showed him clever ways to fix mechanical parts with fewer resources, tricks from her people's engineering. They worked side by side, laughing when things went wrong and celebrating when they went right. Sometimes they argued about small things like how to store supplies or which tools were best for a repair. But even their arguments felt alive, like proof that they were no longer strangers. They were building a life together, one piece at a time. Yet beneath the quiet happiness, Elias felt something deeper stirring, a fear he had never admitted even to himself. He had spent years believing he didn't deserve peace. He had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. And now here he was, daring to believe in something better, daring to hope. One evening, as the suns dipped below the horizon and the desert cooled under a canopy of stars, Elias sat outside on a weathered crate, staring up at the endless sky. Lyra joined him, wrapping a thin blanket around both of them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long time neither spoke. "Do you ever think about before?" he asked quietly. "Before Crash?" she asked, her voice soft. "Before all of this, before we met." She was silent for a moment. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I remember family, my home, my ship." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "It hurts, but I also think about now, and now is better." Her words struck something deep inside him. He thought of his own past, the battles, the losses, the friends who never came home. He had buried all those memories under layers of bitterness and silence. But with Lyra beside him, they no longer felt like weights dragging him down. They felt like stones he had climbed over to reach this place. "Now is better," he repeated, and for the first time in years he truly believed it. Seasons on Riven 9 passed slowly. The harsh storms of winter gave way to gentle winds, and the red sands bloomed with rare desert flowers that painted the horizon in gold and violet. The outpost, once lonely and cold, became a place of warmth, a home filled with laughter, shared meals, and the quiet comfort of companionship. Lyra's language improved with every passing week, and soon their conversations flowed with ease. They spoke about everything, their pasts, their fears, their dreams. She told him stories of her people, tales of far-off stars and ancient traditions. He shared stories of earth, oceans, forests, and the rain that smelled like life itself. Sometimes they planned. They talked about building a larger shelter, planting crops, maybe even exploring the distant mountains. Other times they spoke about going beyond Riven 9 someday together to see the worlds they had both left behind. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, Lyra turned to him with a question that made his heart stop. "Do you regret saving me?" she asked. He stared at her, stunned. "What?" "If you did not save me," she said softly, "your life would stay same. Quiet, alone, maybe easier." Elias laughed, a quiet, broken sound. "Easier, maybe, but emptier too." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't regret saving you, Lyra, not for a second. You didn't just change my life, you gave it back to me." Her eyes shimmered with emotion, and she pressed her forehead gently against his. "And you gave me a second life." They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors, two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their pasts. Months later, a new transmission reached the outpost. This time, it wasn't a distress call or a search party. It was an offer, a message from a human exploration fleet setting up colonies nearby. They were recruiting settlers, offering them a chance to join a new community, a new future among the stars. Elias read the message twice, then he handed it to Lyra. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She thought for a long time. "Do you?" He looked around the outpost, at the tools on the workbench, the plants they'd started growing, the small carved figures she'd made and placed on the shelf. He looked at her, at the way her ears twitched softly in the evening wind, at the warmth in her golden eyes. "I think," he said quietly, "home is not a place, it's where you are." Lyra smiled, the soft, bright smile he had fallen in love with without ever meaning to. "Then we stay or go together." And that was the decision they made. Together. Whatever came next, whether they stayed on this quiet world or built a new life among the stars, they would face it side by side. Because they were no longer two broken strangers clinging to survival. They were a family, forged in fire and loss, strengthened by love and choice. The sun rose over Riven 9 the next morning, painting the desert in gold and crimson. Elias stood at the edge of the ridge, Lyra's hand resting gently in his. The wind carried the scent of sand and distant rain, and the sky seemed brighter than it ever had before. This was not the life he had expected. It was not the life he had planned. But it was his life, their life, and it was more than he had ever dreamed of. And as the first light of dawn touched their faces, Elias knew with absolute certainty that humanity's greatest story wasn't written in battles or conquests or distant stars. It was written here, in the quiet moments, in a choice to save a life, in a hand held through the storm, in a promise whispered beneath a sky full of stars. They had saved each other, and together they would build a future worth living for.